Hello friends, let's talk about James Joyce today. James Joyce is a 20th century writer. His full name was James Augustine Aloysius Joyce, lifespan 2nd February 1882 to 13th January 1941, was an Irish novelist, short story writer, poet, teacher, and a literary critic. He contributed to the modernist avant-garde and is regarded as one of the most influential and important authors of the 20th century. Joyce is best known for his work Ulysses, written in 1922, a landmark work in which the episodes of Homer's Odyssey are paralleled in a variety of literary styles, most famously stream of consciousness, a kind of narrative. In literature, Ulysses was also the hero of Homer's Odyssey. Other well-known works of James Joyce are the short story collection Dubliners 1914 and the novels A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man 1916 and Finnegan's Wake in the year 1939. His other writings include 3 books of poetry, a play, his published letters, and some occasional journalism. Apart from writing, he also had an accomplished tenor, and therefore he could sing very well. He was born on 2nd February 1882 in Dublin, Ireland. Joyce's father was John Stanislaw Joyce and his mother was Mary Jane Murray. He was the eldest of the 10 surviving siblings. 2 died of typhoid. James was baptized according to the rites of the Catholic Church. In 1887, his father was appointed as a rate collector by Dublin Corporation. The family subsequently moved to the fashionable adjacent small town of Bray, 12 miles from Dublin. Around this time, Joyce was attacked by a dog bite, or rather, he was attacked by a dog, leading to his lifelong xenophobia, that is, fear of dogs. He also suffered from astrophobia, that is, fear of thunder and lightning. Joyce had begun his education at Clongowes Wood College, a Jesuit boarding school near Clane, County Kildare, Ireland, in 1888, but had to leave it in 1892 when his father could no longer pay the fee. Joyce then studied at home and briefly at the Christian Brothers O'Connell School on North Richmond Street in Dublin, before he was offered a place in the Jesuits' Dublin School, Belvedere College, in 1893. Joyce later enrolled at the established University College Dublin, UCD, in 1898, studying English, French and Italian. He became active in theatrical and literary circles in the city. Joyce wrote a number of articles and at least 2 plays, since lost, during this period. Many of his friends he made at University College Dublin appeared as characters in Joyce's works. Joyce was first introduced to the Irish public by Arthur Griffith in his newspaper United Irishmen in November 1901. Joyce had written an article on the Irish literary theatre and his college magazine refused to print it. Joyce had it printed himself and distributed it locally. In 1901, the National Consensus of Ireland listed James Joyce 19 as an English and Irish speaking scholar living with his mother and father 6 sisters and 3 brothers at Royal Terrace, now Inverness Road, Clontarf, Dublin. A lot has been spoken about his drinking habit. His father, John Joyce, too, was into heavy drinking and even lost his job because of that. And the habit, sadly, was imbibed by his son, James Joyce. James occasionally even got into brawls because of his drinking habit. And it would not be out of context to say that he had a very restless life. After graduating from University College Dublin in 1902, Joyce left for Paris to study medicine, but he soon abandoned it. This may have been because he found the technical lectures in French too difficult. Joyce had earlier failed to pass chemistry in his own English language in Dublin, but Joyce claimed ill health as the problem and wrote home that he was unwell and complained about the cold weather. He stayed on for a few months, appealing for finance, which his family could ill afford. His mother was diagnosed of cancer when his father sent him a telegram that said, "Another dying, come home, father." Another is a non-standard spelling for another. So he wrote, the father wrote, "Another dying, come home, father." Joyce returned to Ireland fearing for her son's impiety. His mother tried unsuccessfully to get Joyce to make his confession and to take communion. She finally passed into a coma and died. James and his brother Stanislaw refused to kneel with other family members praying by her bedside. After her death, he continued to drink heavily. As a consequence, conditions at home grew quite appalling. He scraped together a living by reviewing some books, teaching and singing. In 1904, while in his early 20s, Joyce emigrated to continental Europe with his partner and later wife, Nora Barnacle. They lived in Trieste, Italy, Paris and Zurich. Although most of his adult life was spent abroad, Joyce's fictional universe centers on Dublin and is populated largely by characters who closely resemble family members, enemies, and even friends from his time there. Ulysses, in particular, is set with precision in the streets and alleyways of the city. In 1891, Joyce wrote a poem on the death of Charles Stewart Parnell. His father was angry at the treatment of Parnell by the Catholic Church. The elder Joyce had the poem printed and even sent a part to the Vatican Library. On 7 January 1904, Joyce attempted to publish a portrait of the artist, an essay story dealing with aesthetics, only to have it rejected by the free-thinking magazine Dana. He decided on his 22nd birthday to revise the story into a novel he called Stephen Hero. It was a fictional rendering of Joyce's youth, but he eventually grew frustrated with its direction and abandoned this work of his. It was never published in this form, but years later in Trieste, Joyce completely rewrote it as a portrait of the artist as a young man. The unfinished Stephen Hero was published after his death. In 1904, he met Nora Barnacle, a young woman from Galway City, Ireland, who was working as a chambermaid. On 16th January 1904, they had their first outing together. They walked to the Dublin suburb Ringsend, where Nora pleased him sexually. This event was commemorated by providing the date for the action of Ulysses as Bloomsday. Joyce and Nora went into self-imposed exile, moving first to Zurich in Switzerland, where he ostensibly taught English at the Berlitz language school. Later he was sent to Trieste, which was then part of Austria-Hungary until the World War I, and is today part of Italy. He later taught in Pola, part of Croatia today. He stayed there teaching English mainly to Austro-Hungarian naval officers stationed at the Pola base from October 1904 until March 1905. Later he moved back to Trieste and began teaching English there. He remained in Trieste for the next 10 years. Later that year, Nora gave birth to their first child, George, known as Giorgio. Joyce persuaded his brother Stanislaw to join him in Trieste and secure a teaching possession for him at the school. Joyce sought to augment his family's meager income with his brother's earnings. Stanislaw and Joyce had strained relations while they lived together in Trieste, arguing about Joyce's drinking habits and frivolity with money. Just a point I would like to make here is, in the earlier days, many authors you'll find, they financially were doing extremely bad. Joyce became frustrated with life in Trieste and moved to Rome in late 1906, taking employment as a clerk in a bank. But he disliked Rome and returned to Trieste in early 1907, so it was either Trieste or Dublin for him. His daughter Lucia was born later that year. Joyce returned to Dublin in 1909 with George, his son, to visit his father and work on getting Dubliners published. While preparing to return to Trieste, he decided to take one of his sisters, Eva, back with him to help Nora run the home. He spent a month in Trieste before returning to Dublin, this time as a representative of some cinema owners and businessmen from Trieste. With their backing, he launched Ireland's first cinema, the Volta cinematography, which was well received but fell apart after Joyce left. He returned to Trieste in January 1910 with another sister, Eileen, for Eva had become homesick for Dublin and returned there a few years later. But Eileen spent the rest of her life in the continent. Joyce returned to Dublin again briefly in mid-1912 for publishing his book Dubliners, but landed into a disagreement with his Dublin publisher. His trip was fruitless, and upon his return he wrote a poem, Gas from a Burner, as an invective against publisher Roberts. After this trip he never again came closer to Dublin than London, despite many pleas from his father and invitations from his fellow Irish writer William Butler Yeats. One of his students in Trieste, Ettore Smith, better known as by the pseudonym of Italo as Vivo, they met in 1907 and became lasting friends and mutual critics. Smith was a Catholic of Jewish origin and became a primary model of Leopold Bloom, the fictional protagonist and hero of James Joyce's Ulysses. Most of the details about the Jewish faith in Ulysses came from Smith's responses to queries from Joyce. While living in Trieste, Joyce was first beset with eye problems that ultimately required over a dozen surgical operations. Truly, James Joyce had a very restless life. Joyce concocted a number of money-making schemes during his period, including an attempt to become a cinema magnate in Dublin. In 1915, after most of his students in Trieste were conscripted to fight in the First World War, Joyce moved to Zurich. Joyce set himself to finishing Ulysses in Paris, delighted to find that he was gradually gaining fame as an avant-garde writer. A further grant from a well-wisher meant he could devote himself full-time into writing again, as well as consort with other literary figures in the city. During this time, Joyce's eyes began to give him more and more problems, and he often wore an eye patch. He was treated in Paris, undergoing 9 operations before his surgeon's death in 1929. Throughout the 1930s, he traveled frequently to Switzerland for eye surgeries and for treatments for his daughter Lucia, who, according to the Joyce's, suffered from schizophrenia. Lucia was analyzed by Carl Jung, a Swiss psychiatrist at the time, who, after reading Ulysses, is said to have concluded that her father too had schizophrenia. Jung said that she and her father were two people heading to the bottom of a river, except that Joyce was diving and Lucia was sinking. In Paris, 2 literateurs, or say activists, nursed Joyce during his long years of writing Finnegan's Wake. Had it not been for their support, this book probably would not have seen the light of the day. The issue of Joyce's relationship with religion is somewhat controversial. Early in life, he gave up on Catholicism. He expressed, "My mind rejects the whole present social order and Christianity. 6 years ago, I left the Catholic Church, hating it most fervently. I found it impossible for me to remain in it on account of impulses of my nature. I made secret war upon it when I was a student and declined to accept the positions it offered me. But by doing this, I made myself a beggar, but I retained my pride. Now I make open war upon it by what I write and say and do." When the arrangements for Joyce's burial were made, a Catholic priest offered a religious service, which Joyce's wife Nora declined, saying, "I couldn't do that to him." Some novelists and historians have argued that Joyce later in life reconciled with the faith he rejected earlier, and that his parting with the faith was succeeded by a not so obvious reunion, and that Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake are essentially Catholic expressions. Likewise, Hugh Kenner and T.S. Eliot believe they saw between lines of Joyce's work the outlook of a serious Christian, and that beneath the veneer of the work lies a remnant of Catholic belief and attitude. Kevin Sullivan maintains that rather than reconciling with faith, Joyce never left it. On 11th January 1941, Joyce underwent a surgery in Zurich for a perforated duodenal ulcer. He fell into a coma the following day. He awoke at 2 a.m. on 13th January 1941 and asked the nurse to call his wife and son before losing consciousness again. They were en route when he died 15 minutes later. Joyce was less than a month short of his 59th birthday. His body was buried in the Flunton Cemetery, Zurich. Although 2 senior Irish diplomats were in Switzerland at the time of his death, neither attended Joyce's funeral, and the Irish government later declined Nora's offer to permit the repatriation of Joyce's physical remains. When Joseph Walsh, secretary at the Department of External Affairs in Dublin, was informed of Joyce's death, he remarked, "If possible, find out, did he die a Catholic? Express sympathy with Mrs. Joyce and explain inability to attend funeral. Buried originally in an ordinary grave, Joyce was moved to in 1966 to a more prominent honor grave with a seated portrait statue by American artist by American artist Milton Hebald nearby. Nora, whom he had married in 1931, survived him by 10 years. She is buried by his side, as is their son, Giorgio, who died in 1976. So, friends, although James Joyce was a great writer, but I must say he had a very, very, very troublesome life, and that's what destiny is all about. So friends, that's all for today. Goodbye and see you soon.